All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this Women on the Land webinar, which will explore forest carbon as well as carbon credit programs. Once again, I'd like to thank the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation for funding the Women on the Land Network through their Working Forest initiative. I would also, of course, like to give a big thank you to all three of tonight's presenters, Paul Catanzaro, Laura Marks, and Justine Crum. Paul Catanzaro is a professor in the forestry program at UMass Amherst and serves as the state extension forester. He also co-directs the Family Forest Research Center, which is a partnership of the USDA Forest Service and UMass. Laura Marks is the climate solutions scientist for the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts. Um, Sorry. She leads the chapter's work on natural climate solutions, including better management and protection of forests, wetlands, and farms to reduce and remove carbon emissions. Last but not least, we're joined by Justine Crum, who is a private landowner in Rowe, Massachusetts, where she has 70 acres enrolled in the Family Forest Carbon Program. She has been enrolled in the program for about a year. And finally, Laura is also joined by her coworker, Nancy Marek, who is an outreach specialist with the Nature Conservancy. And while Nancy won't be officially presenting tonight, she will be on hand to answer any questions about the Family Forest Carbon Program as they come up. So Paul will get us started with some foundations on forest carbon before passing the mic to Laura, who will share an example of a carbon credit program through her work with the Family Forest Carbon Program. And then Justine will share her perspective as a landowner enrolled in the program. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and let Paul take it away.
Thank you, Guthrie. Get my presentation up. Did that look okay?
Looks great.
Outstanding. Good evening, everybody. So my goal for the presentation tonight is to help you better understand forest carbon, where it is in your forests, and how your decisions may influence carbon one way or the other. I want to acknowledge right up front my colleague and friend Tony D'Amato from the University of Vermont. He and I authored this publication you're seeing, and much of the presentation, I guess, will be based on that publication. My presentation tonight is really divided into two parts. The first part of my presentation will talk about forest carbon, and just so you can get a better understanding of what it is, where it is, and how it moves and changes. And then the second part of my presentation is in regard to landowner strategies, things you might want to consider as you're making decisions about your forest, and also, importantly, the trade-offs of those decisions. And then I'll be handing that presentation over to my friend Laura Marks for her presentation. I want to acknowledge the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the Northeast Climate Adaptation Center, NIACS and NECASC, for their support of this work. And I also want to just acknowledge that publication I showed was funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act through USDA. This is a theme that I'm going to come back to over and over during this my portion of the presentation, which is that our forests provide a lot of benefits. Everything from wood products to biodiversity to clean water to cultural products to obviously wildlife. We have lots of wonderful myriad of benefits from our forests. Tonight, we're going to be zeroing in on carbon, but I feel like it's really important to make sure we recognize all of the benefits within the forest. And when we talk about some of those trade-offs, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's just state up front how many wonderful benefits, essential benefits that our forests provide us. My experience has been that one of the most confusing things for people are in regard to forest and carbon are these two terms, and I hear people using them interchangeably, but they really are different. And importantly, as I'll show in a few slides, they have a different peak within forest development through time. So let's pull those apart so we can better understand them and how they change through time in forests. The first one is this idea of carbon storage, and that's a pretty straightforward definition. Carbon storage is the amount of carbon that's retained within your forest in any given time within a carbon pool, and we'll talk more about carbon pools next. That's different than carbon sequestration. Carbon sequestration is actually the process of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, green plants removing carbon dioxide and using that as a raw material within photosynthesis. Obviously, there's a relationship between carbon sequestration, where plants are producing and making their own food and growing, which leads to carbon storage. But those are actually two different terms. And as we'll show, those two different ideas, carbon storage and carbon sequestration, actually peak at different times within the forest. So, carbon storage, carbon sequestration. Carbon pools is another term that you're likely to hear if you're talking about forest carbon. Carbon exists in a variety of places within the forest. We have broken those down into some standard pools. So, for example, one carbon pool is the live above ground pool, which includes trees and shrubs and other plants. There is also a dead wood pool, which is exactly what it says, standing dead trees, down dead logs. There is a litter, those the leaves and needles and twigs and branches that exist on top of the soil. And then, of course, there's the soil organic matter that is its own pool. These pools change over time. Okay, so trees grow larger and fall over and die. So it would have gone from the live tree above ground pool into the dead wood pool. That dead log then degrades and goes back into the soil, and that changes some of the soil carbon pool. As the tree decomposes, it's off-gassing some carbon dioxide, so we're losing some from the system, but other trees are coming in and regenerating. So I hope you get the idea that within these carbon pools, they're not fixed amounts. They change through time naturally, and they can be changed through time through interventions. Just to give you a sense of our current forest, these are numbers that Tony and I pulled from the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Unit. And these are the numbers for the amount of carbon in our current 80 to 100-year-old forest. So these are common forest types that we would have in Massachusetts, particularly that oak pine, northern hardwood. You can see that in these common forest types, the total amount of carbon ranges from about 69 metric tons per acre up to 82 in that oak pine. So we do have some variation within forest types. Importantly, I want you to get a sense of proportion. I want you to get a sense of where, the size of those carbon pools. And if you take a look at those two green colors, the lighter green is the soil carbon pool, the soil organic, and that darker green is the live above ground. So all the trees and shrubs and seedlings and saplings and those sorts of things consistently throughout the all of the forest types, even though the proportion can change and the total amount of carbon changes among those forest types, recognize that the two biggest pools, the two pools with the largest, most amount of carbon in them, are those soil organic and live above ground pools. So when we talk about strategies, particularly when it comes to forest management, but also when we talk about land conversion, we want to be particularly cognizant of those two big carbon pools. So I want to I feel like I'm walking a tightrope here. I'm going to give you a description of forest succession that usually lasts at least 2 or 3 lectures in forest ecology class in about 1 minute. But I want to show you how forests change through time because it has a lot of implications for carbon through time as well. On the right, you're seeing a large natural disturbance. This was a big wind burst that knocked down a forest. On the left is a conceptual diagram that Tony and I put together for this publication. It's this successional clock. So at year 0 is this large disturbance that happened. And then all of the years through the face of the clock are actually the number of years since that large disturbance. So 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years since that large disturbance. And I want to try to communicate to you that forests are dynamic and they're constantly changing. So we've had this big event. And then what we have is this forest stage called pre-forest that lasts for about 15 years. And in that, we call it pre-forest because it's really not dominated by trees. In that first 15 years or so, we see this real flush of herbs and shrubs and things that dominate the site. After about 15 years, the next few decades are what we would call a young forest condition. So those are really saplings that have established, that have outcompeted the herbs and the shrubs that are now shading those herbs and shrubs. The herbs and shrubs go away, and what's left is this young, vigorous forest competing with itself to see who's going to survive into the main canopy. We then go into at about year 50 or so to year 200. We go into what we call the mature forest stage, and that's largely where most of our forests are now, in this 80 to 100 year mature forest stage, where our canopies, we have the winning trees. We are starting to see some holes in those canopies. We are starting to see some down dead trees, but a lot of continuity, a lot of consistency across that forest. And then after about 200 years and beyond, we have what we call this old forest stage. And in this old forest stage, we have this real diversity of tree sizes and tree ages. We get a lot of dead wood from the couple hundred years of disturbances that have been happening in that forest. So we have a much different forest through time. So forests change themselves through time, naturally through growth, through mortality, through natural disturbances. I want to underscore that in part because I want to come back to this slide. We talked up front that there are lots of essential forest benefits that we enjoy and frankly, that we need to survive. I showed you the changes of forest through time to underscore the point that there are different benefits that happen or are maximized in different parts of the forest successional clock. So the wildlife you see at the very early pre-forest condition, 0 to 15, like a chestnut-sided warbler, is not the same kind of wildlife you see in the old forest. Okay? The wood products that we might want from our forest or need from our forest happen at mature forest stage. We wouldn't get those in the pre-forest or the young forest stage. So importantly, we enjoy lots of different benefits, but those benefits are maximized at different stages of forest development. And if we want to maintain all of those wonderful benefits our forests provide, we need to maintain all of those different stages across the landscape. Now, let's bring this back down to carbon. Let's pull that carbon storage and that carbon sequestration apart a little bit. We go back to our successional diagram, and I want you to pay attention to this brown outer ring. That represents carbon storage. And here is our big disturbance that we had at year 0. And as we grow through time, as the forest changes from pre-forest to young forest to mature forest to old forest, what's happening is the forest is accumulating in those carbon pools. It is creating or accruing more carbon in there. There are bigger trees. There's more dead wood. There's more leaf litter. The soil is accumulating more carbon. So one of the things we see as forests change through time is we see the accumulation of carbon storage. That's different than carbon sequestration. We see carbon sequestration peaking out somewhere in this like starting at 10 to 15 years and maybe going to something like 40, 50 years during this young forest condition where my cursor is with all of these saplings. They're like young teenagers. They're doing a lot of vigorous growing. They need lots of raw material to do that. And so they're taking in lots of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to fuel that growth. Now, I've had people say to me, Paul, how can a tree that's 1 inch diameter sequester more carbon than a tree that's 20 inches diameter? And they're 100% right. If you look at individual tree rates of sequestration, a bigger tree is going to sequester more carbon. But in forests and in forestry, we look at the whole forest. We look at a per acre scale. And at that per acre scale, younger forests actually sequester more carbon. So, depending on what your goals are, storage or carbon, carbon sequestration or carbon storage, that happens at different times within the development of that forest. All right. So hopefully you've got a sense of scale of where forest carbon exists, what proportion exists, sort of how it changes through time. And so now I want to spend the last few minutes and just talk about some decisions that you may be making or some strategies you may want to take on in terms of managing or stewarding your own land or land of your town or land trust. Essentially, what it comes down to is this question: what stage of forest development will achieve your goals? So, different stages of forest development provide different or maximize different benefits. What are those benefits you are looking to maximize across your property and within the landscape context? The first thing I'll say is that when we're talking about forest carbon, forest conversion is the biggest loss of forest carbon benefit. So it removes, you're taking a forest and you're turning it into a subdivision. If you're turning it into solar panels, solar field, you're removing that live above ground, you're removing that dead wood pool, you're removing that litter. Depending on what kind of land use you're turning that in, you might be stumping it or grading it with a bulldozer or actually plowing it if it's agriculture. So when we talk about the loss of forest carbon, that conversion from forest to non-forest is really the biggest drop we see in forest carbon. Those losses are often permanent. So when it goes from forest to houses, maybe permanent's too strong of a word. It's at least long term, right? To clear that, you got a lawn, you got a septic, got a house, got a driveway. So we're losing those benefits. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm going to keep coming back to this. We're not only losing the carbon benefits when the forest is gone, but we're losing all of those other wonderful benefits that we rely on. So, in terms of the first strategy for a landowner interested in forests and carbon, I would suggest to you that we need to protect a critical mass of forests in Massachusetts in order to protect this wonderful value one of these wonderful values that our forests give us. And you can see on the left here, this is a graph done by Harvard Forest showing forest cover through time. We had mostly the vast majority of our land area was in forests, and then you can see it in those mid 1800s. It goes down to the 30s or so because of agriculture, and then as farms abandoned, we had this regrowth of forests. But you'll see in the 19s and 70s and 80s, it started going back down, and that second drop is from forests being converted mostly to low density residential. The decision as to what happens to that curve now is up to us, right? We can either take that and increase the forest again. We can, business as usual and keep it steady, or it can go down even more. So that in terms of the benefit you can provide in terms of forest carbon, I would suggest to you the main or the number one priority is keeping forests as forests. Guthrie and I are in the process of putting together a webinar series for landowners. We have a publication on conservation-based estate planning. So if you're interested in learning more about this as a strategy to achieve your financial and personal goals, but also forest carbon goals, I would encourage you to investigate that. One of the other strategies you can undertake in regard to forest management is taking a passive approach to forestry. You can just let nature take its course. Don't harvest any timber. Maybe go in and do some invasive plant control to help the forest in terms of its health. When you do that if you can envision that brown circle coming around the succession clock, it will increase and likely maximize carbon storage as the trees get bigger, as there's more dead wood, as there's more litter, et cetera, et cetera. And if you wanted to do that looking for sites to do that on, I would suggest that you prioritize rich sites that are going to grow lots of biomass, lots of carbon, and try to do that in areas of low disturbance. There are trade-offs, though, to all of these strategies, with the exception of the land protection one, I would suggest. And one of those trade-offs in the passive forest management is our current forests, you can see a picture there, are very uniform for the most part. We've got, there a lot of them were established around the same time, 80 to 100 years ago. They're very consistent. We would call them homogeneous, even aged. And that means that the disturbances that they may be vulnerable to may lead to a significant drop or a high mortality and a significant drop in carbon. So there are opportunities through active forest management to increase that resilience that you may lose on if you are taking a passive approach. We do have a publication called Increasing Forest Resilience, if that's of interest to you, and you can learn more about that. Another trade-off I would suggest that you're making with a passive approach is that there are a number of species, obviously, that use old forests. There are a lot of obligate species that actually use young forests. And so one of the things, if you want to sustain biodiversity, all native biodiversity, then we need those different stages of forests, and active forest management can be a tool to create diversify the habitats within your property, within a landscape, to support that broad diversity of species. Wood products is also a trade-off. If we're not harvesting here responsibly and locally, then where is the wood coming from? What are the environmental impacts of logging in other places that have less rigorous environmental standards? What are the carbon impacts of that, as well as the transportation costs of bringing it here? And what are the ethical implications of asking others to grow the wood that we use? I worked with a number of colleagues on this publication, Beyond the Illusion of Preservation, which quantifies the amount of wood used in New England, including Massachusetts, and the wood produced in those. And I can save you the spoiler alert here, which is in Massachusetts, we have a voracious appetite for wood, and we produce very little of it. So that would be a trade-off from the passive approach. The other strategy, of course, from a forest management perspective, is engaging in active forest management and doing so in using strategies that are carbon informed. One of the biggest strategies that we can use is protecting soil through BMPs, or best management practices. As we showed in those pie graphs from those different forest types, the above ground carbon and the soil carbon are the two biggest pools. So protecting that carbon in the soil is really important and can be done with BMPs. Some other high-level strategies: leaving more trees, leaving bigger trees, and leaving tree species that are capable of being big. In other words, things like red oak and white pine, as they grow and become dominant within the canopy and just sort of become that super canopy, are storing more and more carbon. And what you see in that above ground pool is you see more carbon accumulated and being concentrated in fewer and fewer trees over time. Being sure that as we are engaged in forest management, that we're regenerating species that are predicted to do well in future climates, that are competitive in those climates. Some species are predicted to do well, some are going to potentially hold their own, and some may not do well. We want a diversity of species, and we want them to be vigorous and well adapted. And then, of course, as you're engaged in active forest management, fostering resilience, complexity, lots of different kinds of trees, species, lots of different layers, big trees, medium trees, small trees, dead wood. We don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. So if there is a disturbance that comes through our landscapes, we want it to be resilient, and complexity and diversity is the goal. There is a trade-off with active forest management, and that is when we engage in active forest management, we're removing logs from the forest, we're actually creating a dip in that carbon storage, right? So the dry weight of a log of a tree, about almost 50% of that is carbon. So when we're removing logs from a property, there is a temporary loss of carbon or reduction in carbon until that forest can grow back. We oftentimes look at the carbon impact at a specific property scale, like what's happening right here, right now. And people will see that dip in carbon in terms of the logs coming off of their property. So I like to blow that back out in terms of the frame or the extent or the view we're taking, and just look at some of the data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Unit, which is that for the most part, in all states across New England and New England wide, for every 1 cubic foot of wood that's removed, there are many more cubic feet that are grown. So, for example, in Massachusetts, for every 1 cubic foot removed of wood, there are estimated to be about 5.3 cubic feet that grow. My point being that we might see on a particular site a real drop in that carbon storage. But if you take a larger look across the landscape or across the region or the states, you'll see that we're actually growing a lot more wood than we're using. All right. So I don't want to, and I've been a part of too many conversations where people sort of get into one corner or the other. You should be doing all active management, you should be doing all passive management. And I want to be very clear that it doesn't have to be one or the other. We need both approaches. We need lots of carbon storage and all the wonderful other benefits that come with older forests and passive management. And we need younger forests and more carbon sequestration and all the wonderful benefits, wildlife, et cetera, that come with those younger forests. And you can think about integrating these active and passive approaches in different ways. You can designate your whole property as either active or passive, or you can say this part of my property is going to be passive and the rest of my property is going to be actively managed to sort of balance it. Or even within a part of your property that maybe you're engaged in some active forest management, you can say, no, this patch of woods or this patch of tree or these individual trees I'm keeping on the property. So we can think of integrating this active and passive approach in a variety of ways. I love this photo. You gotta love these drone photos. You're obviously making decisions about your particular property, but it's important to realize and to recognize that you're embedded within this larger landscape. And I love this photo because when I think about what are the characteristics of a landscape that provide long-term carbon, this is a great example. It's got lots of different tree species. You can see the different colors of their leaves, so you can see their different tree species. It's got some retention, a nice patch retention here. So they did some active forest management, but they did some retention here. You can see these trees that are shorter are younger. So we've got different age classes. We've got just lots of complexity going on there. So when we think about resilient carbon and long-term carbon storage, these are some of the characteristics that I would suggest lead to that. And oh, by the way, those aren't just the characteristics for carbon, long-term carbon. Those are the same characteristics I would say we need for wildlife. Those are the same characteristics for good water quality, for long-term wood production, for resilience. So again, these co-benefits ride, and we need a little bit of everything across the landscape. You, of course, get the opportunity to decide what role your property will play. So a couple take-homes. Carbon is one of many essential forest benefits. Climate change is the challenge of our time, but I don't want to lose sight that we want to focus exclusively on carbon and forget about all these other wonderful benefits. I think sustaining forests, vigorous forests, diverse forests for all of the benefits in the long run will be our best bet. The number one action when people ask me about forest carbon and protecting it is keeping our eye on the ball and encouraging landowners to engage in conservation estate planning, or if you're a landowner, making sure you've got a plan to pass your land on with as much forest cover as possible. Promoting these diverse forests in the landscape to sustain all of these benefits over time, and to recognize that there's not a silver bullet, there's not an easy button. There are trade-offs here. And so it's a matter of balancing the trade-offs of carbon with these other benefits and your own personal and financial goals. So this is our website, and these are the dates of the webinar. Guthrie and I are just starting to market this. So if you're interested, we'd love to have you join us. These are the publications that you can download very easily from the main page of masswoods.org. And just to let you know that if these kinds of topics interest you, Tony and I have a book coming out. It's releasing in mid-March called Tending Your Forest, and that might be of interest. And with that, I think it's 7:05, Guthrie. Nailed it.
Perfect timing, Paul.
Good, 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 good. Well, I thank everybody for their time, and I'm going to certainly be here. I'm looking forward to hearing the other presentations and can help answer questions at the end.
That was impressive timing, Paul. The pressure's on. Um, Great. Let me just start my slideshow. So I love presenting alongside Paul for many reasons, but one is that they're just so like every time you're like land protection, right? Forest conservation. It's like the most, I'm like, yes. So I'm actually going to echo a couple of the things that Paul said at the beginning of my talk, but I'm going to narrow down a little bit more on as a forest landowner. You've just heard about all these different types of management that you might be choosing between multiple advantages from our forest, carbon being just one of them. A lot of these things sometimes take money. And so I'm going to talk about an example of one program that pays landowners who are doing some of this work. And when I'm done, we're going to hear from Justine, who is enrolled in this program. So I'm not sure that everyone knows who the Nature Conservancy is, right? Why am I here? Why am I talking to you? So TNC is a global nonprofit organization. We work all around the world. We are a land trust, to Paul's point about forest conservation. We also are a science-based conservation organization. And those crises that Paul mentioned, climate change being sort of the challenge of our time, we really work on these dual crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And the nice thing about working in the forest space is that often the same action can help us with both of those crises at the same time. So Paul just talked about this, right? One of the largest opportunities in New England, if you're looking at ways that the environment and land can help us address climate change, one of our biggest opportunities is climate smart forestry. And Paul just spoke about that continuum of practices, all the ways from passive to active, all sorts of different varieties in between. I'm going to focus on a narrow subset of that, and that is climate smart forestry. Now, nothing bugs me more than people saying that term doesn't mean anything. And like climate smart forestry is actually pretty well defined in the literature as having three characteristics. One is that climate smart forestry practices maintain or increase forest carbon stocks. That's storage that Paul spoke about. Now, in the case of the program I'm going to talk about, that's within 20 years, but people use different time frames. You could do this on a 50-year time frame. You could have something else. So first of all, maintaining or increasing forest carbon stock. Secondly, maintaining or improving forest resilience, which Paul was also just talking about, that ability of the forest to handle all the things that climate change throws at it in terms of natural disasters, while treating people fairly. And that means everything from making sure that loggers have appropriate safety equipment to making sure that landowners are truly informed and consenting to the types of programs they're enrolling in and practices they're doing on their land. Again, like this is going to sound very similar to what Paul said a while ago. I'm going to focus on carbon right now, but there are lots of different reasons that people protect and love their forests. And there's a quote that a TNC colleague of mine, Mark Anderson, uses that I really like, which is that if you care about forests just because they're full of carbon, that's like caring about people just because they're full of calcium, right? We don't ever want to reduce a forest just to this one element, even though that is the focus right now. So many of the same people that Paul worked with, including NIACS, that Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, also worked to develop the climate smart forestry practices that I'm going to talk about today. Back in 2020, we did a couple things. The first thing is that my Forest Service colleagues and I looked up where has anyone put in the scientific literature a practice that they said was climate smart. Let's just put them all on a list. Then we thought about the region that we're in here in southern New England. So, for example, we don't have the same kind of fire intensity that they do in California. We don't tend to drop seeds from helicopters. So, we narrowed it down to practices that would make sense here. And then we did a whole bunch of work with a lot of different stakeholders to narrow that down further. These are some of the stakeholders from Massachusetts and Vermont. I'm sure on here you see groups that you know, that you trust. We tried to get a wide range of input. And although it's a pretty challenging thing to get this diverse a group of people to agree on things, we did. We came up with 10 forest practices. Mass Audubon was doing a similar process at the time. They added 4 additional practices that focus a little bit more on forest resilience and adaptation than on carbon. And you will see these a lot. So we put together these 10 practices in a guide called the Healthy Forest for Our Future guide, but you will also see them in DCR's publications. You'll see them in New England Forestry Foundation's exemplary forestry standards. You'll see some of them in Mass Audubon's publications. And that's not by accident because all of these groups were working together. My colleague Maria Genoviak at one point just started calling this list the one list to rule them all, and that's kind of stuck. The categories that we put into this, that we put these practices under, were basically protect forests, grow new forests and trees, reduce stressors, and manage forests. And all of these are things that can help increase the amount of carbon storage while also maintaining or improving resilience. This is the first, when you look at this guide, the number one practice listed first, and that's not by accident, is avoid forest loss. I agree with everything that Paul said about this. If you can only choose one action on your land and carbon is the thing you are most concerned about, then forest conservation is the way to go. And also, if you're thinking long term about forestry and thinking about how to work carbon into it, that's a natural bridge over to the trees are going to outlive all of us, right? Paul showed that clock, and they can go to 400 years, some species even longer. So if your land is something where you are setting it on a path with your management, it's a natural next step to think about, okay, what's going to happen when I am no longer the one who is managing it? However, I will note that there is always much more interest in Massachusetts in conserving land than there is money to do it, right? This practice often costs money, even if it's just getting a survey or doing a title search. And so this climate smart practice, as well as many of the other ones, cost money. And so we need ways to pay the small private family forest owners that we have in New England. And one of those ways is the Family Forest Carbon Program. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the next couple minutes. This is just one option for covering some of the costs, whether opportunity costs or otherwise, of increasing carbon storage in your woods. Paul ended talking about trade-offs. It's a perfect example of this, right? Any choice that you make on your land is going to have trade-offs. And sometimes, in the interest of carbon storage, you're actually going to be forgoing some income or actually having to put some money into your land. So that Healthy Forest Guide had 10 practices, and essentially 4 of them ended up in the Family Forest Carbon Program, which actually, before I forget, I want to go back just for a moment to be really clear that the Family Forest Carbon Program is run by 2 nonprofits. One is the American Forest Foundation, and the other one is the Nature Conservancy. So 4 of these practices ended up in the Family Forest Carbon Program. 2 of the practices that we had on those guide in the guide is establish forest reserves, and another one is increase time between harvests. And those became the grow older forest practice, which is what Paul just talked about as passive management. So there's no commercial timber harvesting in this practice. Then there are 2 other ones. If you think back to that last aerial photograph that Paul showed, where there were some places where there were young trees and other places where there were old trees, these are the active management practices that went into the program. One is about creating gaps. Another is about retaining more carbon in a thinning. These are active management practices, but I want to be really clear, the only way that you can get an increase in forest carbon storage on the land within 2 decades is to take out very little wood. So there again is that trade-off between producing wood and keeping carbon stored on the land. So these active management practices still only are removing a very small amount of wood from the forest. This is, I was just realizing, like some of you may have gotten a letter. It looked like this. It came from me in 2023, and if you did, you are probably eligible for the Family Forest Carbon Program. However, there are lots of other ways to figure that out. This is just showing the counties that are eligible. So if you're in Worcester County or West in Massachusetts, then you are eligible for this program. It has to be private ownership. So nonprofits can't sign up for the Family Forest Carbon Program, neither can town-owned lands. You have to have a minimum of 30 acres, which in Massachusetts is actually kind of a hard bar. Some other states, that's not a big deal, but we've got a lot of landowners who have less than that. Unfortunately, just the way the program works, the costs are too high for a parcel that's smaller than that. And you have to have a minimum stocking requirement. So that's a lot of technical jargon. But if you think back to, again, Paul's clock, parcels that are enrolling in the Family Forest Carbon Program need to be in a position where they have a lot of carbon stock already, and they can sort of add on to that over time. And you have to have the legal right to commercially harvest. So if you've already protected your land, that's awesome. And protected land is eligible for the Family Forest Carbon Program. But if part of that protection means that you have a conservation easement or restriction with a land trust that says you can't cut any trees, then you wouldn't be eligible. So what are the steps for a landowner who's interested in finding out more? One is that we have Nancy Marek here, which is excellent. Nancy can talk with you about just general questions. Very often we hear from landowners and they're like, I don't really know, like that program sounds kind of intriguing, but I just have some basic questions or have some concerns. I want to talk to somebody about that. Nancy is our outreach person, and she is happy to do that. If you're sure that the Family Forest Carbon Program is something you're interested in, you can actually go to the website, familyforestcarbon.org. It'll actually ask you to click on your land. It'll immediately say either the computer thinks you're eligible or it doesn't. If the computer is wrong, you can always argue with that. Um, and then it'll give you a chance to set up a call with one of the American Forest Foundation staff. The call agents are great. My favorite is Erin, but they're all excellent. And you can basically say, I want to talk to somebody next Tuesday at 9:30 a.m. And they'll give you a call and give you some advice on which practices you're eligible for. Uh, I do want to point out that the grow older forest practice right now is not compatible with enrollment in Chapter 61, but it probably will be starting in 2026. So if that's something that you're interested in, when you sort of start finding out information about the program, it may be actually good to wait a little bit before enrolling. If you enroll and sign a contract, you'll get paid $10 or $15 per acre per year for 20 years. Now, here's where I want to talk about this being a carbon offset market program. And this is my personal opinion, not that of TNC or American Forest Foundation. I find the fact that carbon offset markets, the fact that they exist, to me means we really failed to address climate change 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so a carbon offset market program is something that you want to think about really carefully. Um, the reason that I work in this space and the reason that the Family Forest Carbon Program is around is because there are lots of companies that are willing to pay landowners to do things that increase carbon storage on the land. Um, and that amount of money is somewhat infinitely scalable. So rather than working with landowners and saying, I'd love to work with you, but my grant only allows me to work with 5 people this year, or I have to go fundraise for that, this is a much bigger source of money. But it's also something you want to really look into and make sure that it's the right fit for you because it is not the right fit for everyone. And there are plenty of people who say, I'm just not going to do a carbon offset market program. That's not in line with my values. So some people, that's fine. Some people, that's not. And each landowner makes their own decision. The other reason that the Nature Conservancy is involved in this program is because it's quite different from a lot of the other programs. The early programs had um, some ways in which they placed the risk of being wrong or the risk of something happening to the forest essentially on the planet or on the landowner. And this is a very different approach. The risk is on the program, not on the planet. You don't need to remember the term dynamic baseline. That's again a technical term. But I just want to explain how the family forest carbon makes sure that the land that is enrolled in it is in fact storing more carbon than other similar lands around it. So every year, the U.S. Forest Service is constantly measuring forest carbon. They have a system of plots that they actually go out to. They have a tape measure, put it around the trees, and look at how much the trees have grown since the last time that they measured that plot. And what that does is gives us every year an amount of carbon storage or stock that is in our forests. A lot of this data is analyzed and crunched right at UMass Amherst. So you can go talk with the folks there about this forest inventory and analysis data. In the Family Forest Carbon Program, whenever a landowner enrolls, there are plots that are placed on the land, randomly selected for measurement every year. And that gives us an amount of carbon storage on forests that are identical to the ones the Forest Service is measuring, except that they're enrolled in the Family Forest Carbon Program. And if the program is working as intended, and these practices should be increasing carbon storage, then there will be more carbon stored per acre in the Family Forest Carbon Program forests than in the ones that are outside, that are otherwise the same forest type, things like that, but not in the program. In that case, American Forest Foundation is able to sell that additional carbon into the carbon markets where people are willing to pay a price per ton of carbon. However, if there's the same amount of carbon in the forests that are in the program versus outside, or there's less, then there's no carbon to sell. The landowners have done what they said they would do. They did these practices, so they still get paid. The planet doesn't suffer because there's not carbon that isn't in fact real. All of that risk is on the program. And so that is another way that this program is just pretty different from a lot of the earlier ones and gives us a lot of confidence that it's working both for the landowners and for the climate. Um, I'm going to hand things over to Justine in a moment, but I also wanted to just quickly put up our contact information so that if anyone has questions, you can reach out to me, you can reach out to Nancy. Again, I want to just go back to what Paul said. There's no right answer in terms of what you do on your forest. The climate smart forestry practices that I mentioned are in this healthy forest guide that's linked here. And some people, some of you may look at that and say, I would like to do these practices, and then find that some of those practices you can get paid for through the Family Forest Carbon Program, and that that's a good option. Many others of you will be like, I don't really like any of those 10 practices. They don't resonate with me. I want to do something else, or I want to produce a lot more wood into the local wood markets, or that's just not the right fit for me. And the great thing about being in Massachusetts is that we have a whole range of programs from NRCS, from UMass, from the state. So for any landowner who's looking to figure out what to do with their land, there's probably a way for them to get information and help with that. Um, so I'm going to hand things over to Justine because that was, obviously a much too fast introduction, similar, Paul, to what you were saying. It takes 3 lectures to go through succession and you're going to do it in like 5 minutes. There's no way that I could cover a program like that in, that short a time, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to it and then hand things over to Justine because Justine has gone through the process of enrolling in that program and was kind enough to come share her story so that that might help since as landowners, you're probably wondering a little bit more about how that works and have questions about it. So yeah, Justine, I'll hand things over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. And I always appreciate listening to you speak and to Paul speak because, again, there's always something to learn. And this program has been quite excellent. So, good evening, everyone. As said, I'm Justine. I'm a landowner here in Rowe, Massachusetts, and I manage my family property with a focus on both recreation and long-term forest health. That said, I serve as the chair for the town's Open Space and Recreation Committee and as a member of our Conservation Commission. So for me, forest stewardship is both personal and a civic interest of mine. So how did I hear about the program? Well, I first learned about the Family Forest Carbon Program, to be honest. It was while I was scrolling through Facebook. And I saw it a few times and I'm like, this has got to be one of those fake news type of things. This can't be real. It sounded way too good to be true. Well, again, seeing it the second time, I was like, let me do my own research. My background's in cybersecurity, so let me do some research. So I reached out to the Massachusetts USDA office, which is there's an office not too far away, and I, made a phone call and I was like, okay, let me check this out to see if it's legitimate. They confirmed it, obviously, and encouraged me to explore further from there and gave me some other points of contact. And so I immediately jumped on the opportunity to get involved and learn more. When I started going through the process, the enrollment experience, it was very straightforward for anybody who's interested out there. I did work with Erin. Her name was previously mentioned. She was knowledgeable, professional, and very patient with me because I had a lot of questions. She and the rest of the staff, they walked me through each of the steps and really helped me understand about my specific acreage, how it would fit in, how it aligns with the program goals, what the options are. And I really appreciated that it just wasn't about paperwork, but it was about developing like a deeper um, understanding of how to manage my forest in a climate smart way, what kind of tools or methods could use, and then like when Nancy came out onto my property, she kind of gave me some, tailored guidance on how to keep the property, what to do with the forest, how to manage it for those acres that were a part of the program, and then some of the acres that didn't qualify for the program. So I could keep this going for many generations, which I really did appreciate. Um, if I'm thinking about the program benefits and those impacts, one of the biggest ones for me was the availability to take the funds that come with the program and then reinvest it back into the management and care of the land. So whether that was, we've had these old trails from, decades ago harvesting. So whether that's like, some trail maintenance so we can get out and enjoy the property, or monitoring the overall forest health in an area where New England Power came in. They were working on a road and a bridge that abuts our property, and they had to cut down a bunch of trees. Just really not happy with it, but they had to cut down a few trees, and so that part of the property wasn't in the program, but I was able to take some of the funds from the program and then reinvest in planting some trees that would be climate hardy for the expected some white and red oaks in that area. So I really appreciate that I had the flexibility to do that. So the program, though, it goes beyond a little bit of that financial value. It helps strengthen my connection to the broader forestry community and conservation community. And through this process, it helped me have informed discussions with Mass Audubon and with our town's park commission as we plan conservation efforts within the town. Um, as the head of the open space and recreation and a conservation member, we're always looking for the town to manage the town forests and how to rebalance or how to balance recreation with the habitat and climate resilience. And I know even though this program is designed for privately owned woodlands, I was able to take the principles that I've learned from this and think about how the public land stewardship should be worked. What's our open space and recreation plan for the next 10 years? For conservation, what are some of the things we can do? One example is our town is procuring 178 acres using the land grant, Massachusetts land grant, And we're exploring how to incorporate, similar science-based practices for maintaining the forest health and the carbon storage, and the habitat connectivity to the long-term management of our forest plan for that area. And so for me, the Family Forest Carbon Program has been a great model for both the private and the public land management, for the town and for my family, which we're nested right into it. So it's close to my heart. Um, just to kind of wrap up, I think for many of us who own woodland, we deeply care about the forests, but sometimes we're not really sure what's the next step to make, and are we making the right decisions when we're managing our land? And the Family Forest Carbon Program really helped make looking forward planning both accessible and practical with all the information they had. So it's helped me see that my woodland is not just a personal retreat, which I'd love to be out in almost every single day, but it's part of that larger solution for the greater community, that's scientifically sound, financially sustainable, and then rooted in good stewardship. So thank you to everybody, the Nature Conservancy and UMass, for allowing me to talk today and for this partnership, because it's been a very rewarding experience, and I hope others are able to see value and work in it as well. Back over to you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura and Justine, for providing that overview. Very thorough overview we got from all three of our presenters. At this point, I will go ahead and stop our recording and we can dive into our Q&A session.